Layla tightened her grip on the pen, her hand trembling as she stared at the contract before her. One signature, one moment of surrender, could pull her family out of the crushing depths of poverty. Across the room, Ethan Cross, the enigmatic millionaire with a reputation as cold as the marble floors beneath his feet, leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze fixed on her. "This is a business transaction," he said smoothly, as though he wasn't asking for the most intimate part of her life. "You leave with what you need, and I leave with what I want. No strings." Layla's heart pounded. This decision would change everything, but at what cost? With a deep breath, she signed her name, unaware that this deal would mark the beginning of a story far more complicated and far more dangerous than either of them could imagine. Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. Layla sat by the dim glow of a single bulb in her tiny apartment. The stack of bills on the table was like a mountain she couldn't climb, each one stamped with red letters screaming overdue. Her siblings slept in the next room, their soft snores mingling with the faint wheeze of her mother's labored breathing. She had done everything, waitressed long shifts, cleaned houses, even sold off her late father's tools. But it wasn't enough. As her phone buzzed on the table, she reached for it, expecting another collection call. Instead, it was an email, the subject line stark and simple: opportunity. She opened it, her tired eyes scanning the words. One night. No strings attached. $500,000. Her first reaction was disbelief. She thought it had to be a scam, but the more she read, the more real it seemed. It wasn't just a random offer. They wanted someone specific, a virgin. Layla's stomach turned at the thought. She tossed the phone aside and buried her face in her hands. "I can't do this," she whispered to herself. But the image of her mother struggling to sit up, of her siblings going hungry, wouldn't leave her mind. For days, she tried to ignore the offer, but every trip to the mailbox brought more bills, more threats of eviction. By the end of the week, her resolve was breaking. Ethan Cross was used to getting what he wanted. From his penthouse suite overlooking the city, he skimmed through profiles his assistant had compiled. A different face, a different story, yet all the same to him in the end. He didn't care about their reasons, only the transaction. "This one," he said, tapping on Layla's profile. "Make it happen." Layla stood at the entrance of the luxury hotel, clutching the strap of her worn bag. She'd never been anywhere this fancy. The chandeliers glittered like stars, the marble floors polished to perfection. Everyone seemed to glide past her, their lives effortlessly beautiful. She felt like an intruder. "Miss Layla?" A sharply dressed man approached her. "Mr. Cross is expecting you. Please, this way." The elevator ride felt endless, the quiet hum amplifying her racing heartbeat. When the doors opened, Ethan Cross stood before her, tall and impeccably dressed, his sharp features accentuated by the soft lighting. He exuded confidence and power in a way that made her want to shrink into herself. "Miss Layla," he said, his voice smooth, almost detached. "You're right on time." "I appreciate that." She followed him into the suite, her footsteps hesitant. The room was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city skyline. A contract and a thick envelope sat on the table in the center. "You can leave at any time," Ethan said, pouring himself a glass of wine. "No pressure. But if you sign, you'll have everything you need to take care of your family." Layla sat down, her fingers brushing over the envelope. She didn't need to open it to know it held more money than she'd ever seen. Ethan slid a pen across the table, his gaze steady on her. "I've read your file," he said suddenly, his voice softer. "I know why you're doing this. I don't judge. Neither should you." Her throat tightened. How could she not judge herself? She glanced at the contract, the words blurring before her. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but the faces of her family filled her mind. She thought of her mother's hospital bills, her siblings' futures, the crushing weight of it all. With trembling hands, she picked up the pen. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression unreadable. "Take your time." But Layla didn't want more time. Time meant doubt, and doubt meant running back to the life that had suffocated her. She signed her name. As she set the pen down, a strange calm washed over her. It was done. There was no turning back now. Ethan stood, walking to the window and gazing out at the city lights. "You've made the right choice," he said without turning around. "After tonight, your life will change." Layla didn't respond. She wasn't sure if she believed him. All she knew was that nothing about her would ever be the same. The room fell silent, the weight of the deal hanging between them like a storm cloud. The silence in the room was deafening as Layla sat on the edge of the luxurious bed, staring at the envelope of cash on the nightstand. The night had passed, just as Ethan had promised, but something inside her felt fractured, as though she'd left a piece of herself behind. She slipped the envelope into her bag, her hands trembling. Ethan sat by the window, a glass of wine in his hand, his expression unreadable. The sharp lines of his face were illuminated by the city lights outside, but there was no warmth in his gaze. "You'll get used to it," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, almost indifferent, as though this were routine for him. Layla didn't reply. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, suddenly feeling cold despite the warmth of the room. She wanted to leave, but her legs felt heavy, as if the weight of her decision was anchoring her in place. Ethan stood and walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. "You've made a smart choice, Layla. This is just a means to an end. Don't dwell on it." Her eyes darted up to meet his, a flicker of defiance in them. "Maybe it's easy for you to say that," she murmured. "But you don't know what it's like to feel empty." Ethan tilted his head slightly, surprised by her candor. For a moment, something almost resembling emotion crossed his face, but it vanished just as quickly. "You'll thank yourself later," he said simply. Layla didn't respond. She grabbed her bag and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the silence. As she reached for the handle, Ethan's voice stopped her. "You're not like the others," he said quietly. She froze, her fingers tightening on the handle. "Don't try to make this personal," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Without looking back, she opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The ride home was a blur. Layla sat on the bus, staring out the window as the city sped by, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. She clutched her bag tightly, the envelope of cash burning a hole in her thoughts. When she reached her apartment, the sight of her mother sleeping on the worn-out couch brought tears to her eyes. She tiptoed inside, careful not to wake anyone, and placed the envelope on the kitchen table. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at it. This money would save them. It would pay for her mother's medication, keep the landlord off their backs, and maybe even give her siblings a chance at a better future. But it came at a price she wasn't sure she could live with. Days turned into weeks, and the money began to work its magic. The landlord stopped calling, and her mother's health improved with the new medication. Layla even managed to buy her siblings a few new clothes for school. But with every small victory came whispers. At first, they were subtle, sideways glances from the neighbors, hushed conversations that stopped when she entered the room. Then they grew louder. "Where'd she get all that money? She must have done something shameful. She's not as innocent as she looks." Layla felt the weight of their judgment every time she stepped outside. The bakery where she worked part-time grew cold toward her co-workers avoiding her during breaks. Even her siblings began asking questions she couldn't answer. "Where did you get the money, Layla?" her youngest brother asked one night, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. I worked hard for it," she replied, her voice shaking. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Ethan, meanwhile, found himself unable to stop thinking about Layla. There had been something different about her, something raw and real. She hadn't been like the others who treated the arrangement as a game. She had been desperate but not weak, vulnerable but not broken. Against his better judgment, he asked his assistant to look into her background. When the report arrived, he read it in silence, his jaw tightening with every word. A sick mother, 2 younger siblings, a father lost to an accident years ago, endless debt. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something foreign, guilt. One evening, as Layla returned home, she found Ethan waiting outside her building. He leaned against his sleek black car, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to the crumbling apartment complex. She froze, her bag slipping off her shoulder. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion and irritation. "I came to see how you're doing," he replied, his tone unusually soft. "I'm fine," she said curtly, brushing past him. "Layla, wait," he called after her. She stopped, turning slowly to face him. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It was a deal, remember? No strings attached." Ethan hesitated, his normally confident demeanor faltering. "I know. But you're not okay, are you?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. "What do you want, Ethan? To fix me? To make yourself feel better?" You don't know what it's like to live like this. He took a step closer, his gaze earnest. Then help me understand. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the space between them filled with unspoken truths. Finally, Layla sighed, her walls beginning to crack. You can't fix what's already broken, she whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened. Maybe not. But I can try. The morning sunlight streamed through the bakery's windows as Layla arranged trays of freshly baked bread. The smell of warm dough filled the air, offering a momentary comfort. She wiped her hands on her apron, stealing a glance at the clock. The bakery wasn't her dream, at least not yet, but it paid enough to keep her family afloat. Just as she was about to head to the counter, two women walked in, their voices loud enough to carry across the room. Did you hear about her? One whispered, her eyes darting toward Layla. Suddenly, she's got money to throw around. New clothes, bills paid. Where did that come from? The other leaned closer, her voice dripping with malice. It's obvious, isn't it? A girl like her doesn't make that kind of money honestly. Layla froze, her hands tightening around the counter. She didn't need to ask who they were talking about. The bakery suddenly felt suffocating, the air heavy with judgment. That afternoon, the whispers spread like wildfire. As Layla walked through her small town, the stares followed her like shadows. A group of teenagers snickered as she passed, their laughter echoing in her ears. Guess selling yourself pays well, one of them muttered. Her cheeks burned with shame, but she kept her head down, quickening her pace. Every glance, every hushed conversation felt like a dagger. When she got home, her mother was sitting at the table, her frail hands trembling as she tried to sip tea. Layla hesitated in the doorway, her chest tightening at the sight of her. Layla, her mother said softly, setting the cup down. People, they're saying things about you. Layla's heart sank. What kind of things? Her mother hesitated, looking away. That the money you've been bringing in, it didn't come from honest work. For a moment, Layla wanted to scream, to tell her mother everything. But how could she? How could she explain that she had sold a piece of herself to save them? Instead, she forced a small smile. They don't know anything, she said quietly. Let them talk. Her mother reached out and took her hand, her grip weak but steady. Whatever you did, Layla, you did it for us. Don't let them make you feel ashamed. That night, Layla sat alone in her room, staring at the ceiling. The whispers had become a storm, one she couldn't outrun. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she picked it up, half expecting another cruel message. Instead, it was a call from an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering. Hello. Layla, Ethan's voice came through, steady and calm. Her grip tightened on the phone. What do you want, Ethan? I heard about what's happening, he said. The rumors, the gossip. Are you okay? She laughed bitterly. Does it matter? People have already made up their minds. They'll believe whatever they want. It does matter, Ethan replied, his voice firmer now. You don't deserve this. Layla closed her eyes, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Why do you care, Ethan? You got what you wanted. Isn't that enough? There was a pause on the other end. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. I care because you didn't deserve to pay the price you did. Let me help you. A few days later, Ethan arrived in Layla's town unannounced. His sleek black car stood out like a sore thumb among the modest homes and narrow streets. He found her at the bakery, kneading dough with a furrowed brow. Ethan, she said, her voice filled with surprise and annoyance. Why are you here? He stepped inside, his presence commanding the small space. Because you're not handling this alone anymore. Layla wiped her hands on her apron, crossing her arms. You can't just show up and fix things. This is my life, not one of your business deals. Ethan looked around the bakery, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Maybe it's not my place, but I've been where you are. The rumors, the stares, it doesn't go away unless you take control of the narrative. She scoffed. And how exactly am I supposed to do that? He stepped closer, his gaze steady. You have a passion, Layla. Baking. Let's use that. Let me help you start your own bakery, something you can be proud of. Something no one can take away from you. Layla stared at him, her walls slowly crumbling. Why do you care so much? Ethan hesitated, then said quietly, because I see more in you than you see in yourself. Later that night, as Layla sat at her kitchen table, Ethan's words echoed in her mind. She had spent so long surviving, she had forgotten what it felt like to dream. The whispers still haunted her, but for the first time, a flicker of hope began to bloom. Maybe, just maybe, she could rise above it all. The faint smell of sawdust filled the air as Layla stepped into the vacant shop space Ethan had rented for her. The walls were bare, the counters non-existent, and the floors scuffed from years of neglect. Yet, to Layla, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "You're serious about this?" she asked, her voice still tinged with disbelief. Ethan stood beside her, his hands in the pockets of his tailored coat. He scanned the space, his expression unreadable. "Completely. This is your bakery, Layla. Your chance to rewrite the story." Layla turned slowly, taking it all in. The space felt impossibly large, its emptiness intimidating. "It's too much," she whispered. Ethan glanced at her, his gaze softening. Nothing is too much for someone willing to fight for their future. "Besides," he added with a faint smirk, "you've got me in your corner. We'll make it work." She gave him a skeptical look. "You're not exactly the roll-up-your-sleeves type." Ethan chuckled, a rare sound that caught her off guard. "True. But I can hire people who are." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Contractors came and went, transforming the dusty space into something that felt alive. Layla spent her days choosing countertops, selecting ovens, and tasting paint colors. It was exhausting, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of purpose. Ethan was there more often than she expected, offering his input on everything from the layout of the kitchen to the design of the logo. At first, she thought he was just being controlling, but she quickly realized he genuinely cared. One evening, as the contractors wrapped up for the day, Ethan and Layla stood outside the shop, watching the neon sign flicker to life for the first time. Layla's bakehouse, it read in elegant cursive. "It's perfect," Layla said, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan crossed his arms, a small smile playing on his lips. "You did this, Layla. I just gave you a push." She turned to him, her expression serious. "Why are you really doing this? Is it guilt? Pity?" Ethan's smile faded, and he looked at her for a long moment before answering. "At first, maybe it was guilt," he admitted. "But now? I see potential in you. I see someone who deserves more than what life handed her." Layla looked away, the weight of his words settling in her chest. "I don't know if I can live up to all this," she said softly. "You already have," he replied. As the opening day approached, Layla threw herself into perfecting her recipes. She spent hours in the kitchen, testing and tweaking until every loaf of bread, every batch of cookies, was just right. Her siblings helped where they could, and even her mother, though still frail, insisted on rolling dough alongside her. "I'm proud of you, Layla," her mother said one evening, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father would be, too." Layla blinked back tears, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and sadness. For the first time in years, she felt like she was building something, not just for herself, but for her family. Opening day arrived with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Layla stood behind the counter, her apron neatly tied, her hands trembling slightly. A small crowd had gathered outside, drawn in by the scent of freshly baked goods and the allure of a new business. As the first customers trickled in, Layla greeted them with a nervous smile. Some were neighbors, their curiosity outweighing the whispers that had followed her for weeks. Others were strangers, drawn in by the buzz surrounding the bakery. Ethan arrived just before noon, his presence as commanding as ever. He stood quietly in the corner, watching as Layla interacted with customers, her confidence growing with each passing moment. "Not bad," he said when she finally had a moment to breathe. "Not bad," she echoed, raising an eyebrow. "This place is packed." Ethan chuckled. "Fine. It's impressive." "Happy?" Layla grinned, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "Very." By the end of the day, Layla was exhausted but exhilarated. The bakery had been a success, and the whispers that had once followed her seemed to fade into the background. She leaned against the counter, watching as her siblings helped clean up. Ethan approached her, holding out a cup of coffee. "You survived," he said with a smirk. "Barely," she replied, taking the cup gratefully. She sipped it, then looked at him thoughtfully. "Thank you, Ethan. For everything." He shrugged, but there was a warmth in his eyes. "Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning." Layla nodded, her heart swelling with determination. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was in control of her future. And she wasn't about to let it slip away. The morning rush at Layla's bakehouse had just ended, and Layla was wiping down the counters when she noticed two women lingering near the display case. Their whispers were faint, but Layla didn't need to hear the words to know they were about her. "That's her," one said, her voice sharp. "The one everyone's been talking about." Layla clenched her jaw and kept her focus on cleaning, trying to block them out. The whispers had diminished over the past few weeks, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. People still talked, still speculated about where her money had come from. "Excuse me," Layla said, her voice calm as she straightened up. "Can I help you?" The women exchanged a glance before one of them replied with a saccharine smile. "Just browsing. Lovely shop you've got here, considering." Layla's stomach churned, but she held her ground. "Let me know if you need anything," she said, forcing a polite smile. As the women left, the door jingling behind them, Layla released a shaky breath. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. No matter how much she tried to rise above it, the judgment always found a way to creep back in. That evening, Ethan arrived at the bakery unannounced, as he often did. He found Layla sitting at one of the small tables, her head in her hands. "Rough day?" he asked, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. Layla sighed, looking up at him. "Do you ever feel like no matter what you do, people only see the worst in you?" Ethan tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "More times than I can count." She gave him a skeptical look. "You? A billionaire with everything handed to him?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You think I don't know what it's like to be judged? To have people assume they know who I am because of my money, my name?" Layla didn't respond, but her expression softened slightly. "Look," Ethan continued, "the whispers don't define you. The people who talk, they're just scared of what they don't understand. Let them talk. You've already proven them wrong." Layla frowned, his words sinking in. "Sometimes it feels like I'll never escape it." "You will," Ethan said firmly. "But only if you stop letting them live rent-free in your head." The next day, Layla threw herself into her work. The bakery had quickly become the heart of her small town, and she wanted it to be a place people came for comfort, not gossip. But as the day went on, it became clear that the whispers had taken on a new life. Customers were polite but distant, their smiles forced. Layla overheard snippets of conversations, words like unworthy and tainted cutting through the air like knives. By the afternoon, Layla had had enough. She stepped out into the alley behind the bakery, her chest heaving with frustration. She leaned against the wall, her head tilted back, eyes stinging with unshed tears. Ethan appeared moments later, as if he had sensed her distress. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low. Layla shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. "Layla," he said, stepping closer. "Talk to me." She turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "Why did you do this, Ethan? Why did you help me when you knew this would happen? You knew they'd never stop judging me." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I helped you because you deserved better. Because you're not the person they think you are. But it doesn't matter what I do." Layla shot back. "They've already made up their minds. To them, I'll always be the girl who sold herself for money." Ethan took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "Then prove them wrong. Show them you're more than their small-minded opinions. You don't owe them an explanation, Layla. But you owe yourself the chance to rise above it." Layla stared at him, her anger slowly ebbing away. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," Ethan admitted. "But you're stronger than you think." That evening, Layla made a decision. She called a town meeting at the bakery, inviting anyone who wanted to come. By the time the clock struck 7, the bakery was packed, the air buzzing with curiosity. Layla stood behind the counter, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "I know there have been rumors about me, about where I got the money to open this bakery." The room fell silent, every eye on her. "I won't lie to you," she continued. "I made a choice, a difficult, painful choice, to help my family. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's something I'll never regret, because it gave my mother the medication she needed and kept a roof over our heads." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Layla pressed on. "This bakery is my second chance. It's my way of building something honest, something good. And I hope it can be a place where everyone feels welcome, no matter their past." She paused, scanning the crowd. "If you can't accept that, I understand. But I won't let anyone's judgment stop me from moving forward." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, a woman in the back began to clap. Others joined in, their applause growing louder until the entire room was filled with the sound. Tears filled Layla's eyes as she stood there, overwhelmed. For the first time in weeks, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Ethan, standing near the back, caught her eye and gave her a small nod. She nodded back, a faint smile breaking through her tears. The whispers might never completely disappear, but Layla knew now that she had the strength to face them. And she wasn't alone. Weeks had passed since Layla's heartfelt speech at the bakery. The whispers had quieted, replaced by something she hadn't expected: respect. Customers now came not just for her pastries, but to support her. They spoke warmly of her courage, of her determination to rise above the shadows of her past. For the first time in years, Layla felt like she belonged. It was early morning, and the smell of fresh bread wafted through the bakery. Layla stood behind the counter, her sleeves rolled up, dusting flour off her hands. The door jingled, and Ethan walked in, his usual confident stride carrying him to the counter. "You're early," Layla said with a teasing smile. Ethan shrugged. "I heard the coffee here is decent. Thought I'd try it." Layla laughed, pouring him a cup. "On the house," she said, sliding it toward him. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You're getting soft." "Don't get used to it," she shot back. As the morning rush began, Layla moved with ease, greeting customers, taking orders, and sharing smiles. Her siblings helped behind the scenes, and even her mother occasionally sat by the window, watching the bustling shop with pride. By noon, the bakery was filled with chatter and laughter. A group of teenagers sat by the corner table, sharing cookies and gossiping about school. An older couple debated over which loaf of bread to buy, while a young woman snapped photos of her beautifully frosted cupcake. Ethan watched it all from his seat, his coffee long forgotten. There was something about the way Layla moved, the confidence in her stride, the warmth in her smile, that struck him. She wasn't the same girl he had met months ago. When the crowd thinned, Ethan approached her, leaning casually against the counter. "You've built something incredible," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Layla glanced at him, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I had help." Ethan shook his head. "No. I gave you a nudge. You did the rest." She looked at him for a moment, then smiled. "Thank you, Ethan, for believing in me." He smirked. "It wasn't hard. You're hard to ignore." Later that evening, after the bakery had closed and her siblings had gone home, Layla sat by the window, sipping tea. The streetlights cast a warm glow over the empty road, and the soft hum of the city filled the air. Ethan sat across from her, his jacket draped over the back of his chair. They had fallen into a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. "Do you ever think about how this all started?" Layla asked suddenly, her gaze distant. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You mean the deal?" She nodded. "All the time," he admitted. "It's not exactly my proudest moment." Layla looked at him, surprised. "You regret it?" Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "I regret how it started, but not where it led." Layla smiled softly, her heart stirring with emotions she didn't fully understand. "Neither do I," she said quietly. They sat there for a while longer, the unspoken understanding between them growing stronger. The next morning, Layla stood outside the bakery, watching the sun rise. The world felt different somehow, brighter, fuller. The whispers, the judgment, the pain, they were still there, lingering in the background. But they didn't define her anymore. As the first rays of sunlight hit the bakery's sign, Layla felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had built something meaningful, something that mattered. And for the first time, she allowed herself to dream about what might come next. Ethan joined her a few moments later, his hands in his pockets. "Big plans for today?" he asked. Layla grinned. "Always." He chuckled. "Good. You're unstoppable now." She glanced at him, her smile softening. "I had a good teacher." Ethan didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said more than words ever could. Together, they stood there, watching the world wake up, ready to face whatever came next. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story. Do not forget to turn on your notification for my next video.